Is therapy dead? Is therapeutic neutrality a thing of the past? What even is therapeutic neutrality? And how do we contrast that with informed consent, with the ethical obligation to disclose to our prospective clients that we do have opinions and biases and, a cultural background that of course are going to inform the way we work with a given topic. And while there are certain commonalities we would hope that all members of the public could expect from any given therapist in terms of following the basic ethical principles, there's still a lot of variation.
You must be some kind of therapist.
Welcome back. Today is the second time that we're doing one of these sort of returning guests group dialogues. So for listeners who are just hearing this for the first time, I've basically made a choice to invite back some former guests of the show in various configurations to have group conversations so that I get to deepen relationships with friends and colleagues over time and just sort of explore new topics as they arise. So today I have David Teachout and Christine Sefein with me here. They're both therapists who've been on this show before, and I'll have them each introduce themselves just to sort of remind listeners where you might have heard them before and just sort of who they are and what they're up to. So David, I'll have you go first.
Thank you,
and by the way, I forgot to say, of course, thank you both for joining me.
Happy to be here.
Yes.
Absolutely. So yes, David Teachout, I believe, was in episode 37. I think it was Reclaiming Your Mind, Recovering from Religious Trauma. And, I write often at, lifelavings.substack.com and, of course, my own website, lifelavings.com. I work with a lot of people on issues of identity from a non-traditional kind of therapy idea, in the sense that, you're not reducible to a diagnosis. And we'll often, operate from a far more philosophy worldview, with the idea that eventually you don't need to talk to me as often. I'm not here to be your guru for this your life. I've got other things to do. So happy to come on in and have a fun chat. Looking forward to it.
Christine?
All right. I'm Christine Sefein, and I'm from episode 51, which was Wokeness versus the Counseling Profession. And for those of you that might have seen it or may not have, I was a professor teaching in a counseling program here in Southern California that was very ideologically captured. And I sort of got to a point where I had to make a decision whether I was going to continue on and infuse some of that into my teaching, or if I was going to take a stand and say, this isn't going to work for me, which I did. So I left, I resigned, and I hopped around a little bit, figuring out what my next steps were. And I stumbled onto Critical Therapy Antidote, which is a network of therapists that's global. So we have members from all over the world that are trying to sort of return back to the healing ethos and practice of therapy and away from the ideological capture. So with that group, we've started some peer consultation groups, which have been fantastic. And we're talking about perhaps putting a conference together in the coming year and a half or so. We'll see how far we're able to get. And just really trying to expand the network so that therapists feel as though they have a home. A lot of what we hear from therapists that belong to the network are that they felt homeless at some point, not exactly in line with this ideological capture, and also not sure where to find other colleagues who have the same feelings and thoughts as they do. So that's been very fulfilling for me, and that's where I've spent a majority of my time. I see clients occasionally as well, but developing CTA has been where I've put most of my efforts in the past couple of years.
The latest developments at CTA are pretty exciting. I love the idea of a CTA conference. And I did make an easy to find CTA link. So if you just go to sometherapist.com/CTA, that'll take you to the join page where you can sign up for the new membership that you guys have worked hard to create, with all those perks like the trainings and peer consultations and all that good stuff you guys are up to. So today we're going to talk about, is therapy broken? What about this concept of therapeutic neutrality in an age of ideological capture, culture wars, everyone having their own bias? What are the limits to the concept of therapeutic neutrality, and how do we contrast that with the idea of informed consent. And we might even get into our own little disagreement because before we started recording, as we were exploring these ideas, we discovered a particular clinical issue that David and I are actually very different about, which is the concept of porn addiction. So listen up, stay tuned for that part where we will explore in real time an example of therapists who actually are pretty like-minded on a lot of issues, but who might approach that issue differently, and sort of exploring, like, what are our biases, and is that part of an informed consent process, and where do we draw, ethical boundaries to how we can approach different things. So David, you had mentioned before we started recording that you've heard a lot of horror stories lately about bad therapy. And of course, most of these stories you're hearing in the context of therapy, so you can't compromise your client confidentiality, of course, but within the limits of what you can share without compromising confidentiality, what have been some of the themes that you've come across?
A lot of it, speaking of, to try to keep it within the bounds of the broader conversation around and bias, and to use the therapy word, heuristic, basically how people baseline assume reality works. And quite often, we'll encounter the ideas of, basic ideas around emotions, for that matter, or which is then, of course, inevitably tied, or quite often tied, to CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, as being, of course, the only, means for, dealing with fill in the blank everything, because, well, money is poured into studying it, and therefore, this must be the, evidence-based, thing, which is another, bias as well. Because the question then becomes, what is actually meant by even evidence, and how you do that. And then you throw in the ideas of the replication crisis and all the problems in how even research is done, and you've got all sorts of extra issues. But to bring it back down to some of the examples, I mean, I've had everybody from, let's celebrate with a 12 days of hatred because you're not in touch with your inner, anger. So, let's, get rid of that gratitude stuff. That's for, the upper echelons of society, and you need to understand the world is against you. Probably going to talk about woke stuff later on with Christine here. So, it's that whole thing of like, you're part of the disadvantaged groups. So therefore you need to get in touch with your anger. And this will help you figure out why your husband is in fact an awful person, and you need to just tell him what's up. So 12 days of anger to we need to obsessively look at all the nasty things. The common thing is we need to unearth this, we need to delve deep. The number of clients that I have who have said, well, when are we going to talk about my childhood? And my usual rejoinder is, well, let's see, you're 40. Did anything happen in the 30 years between your childhood and this? Or are we just kind of skipping over all of that? Like, really, how was that meaningless? Did it play no role whatsoever? Is your brain still exactly the same as it was when you were 5? All of the above, no. I mean, this notion that which is a common assumption around, we just need to unearth in order to quote unquote heal, as if the issues out of Van der Kolk's body keeps the score is inherently legit, which none of it is. And so these things
You
get
have a lot
kept
of
up.
controversial ideas.
Oh yeah, no,
You're saying a
I
lot
don't
right
get
now,
invited.
David.
Yeah,
I
I
used
don't
to
get
teach
invited
that
to
club.
therapy picnics. So
Well, hold
yeah.
on. I feel like you've said a lot right there, and I'm sure there was somewhere more you were going.
Well, I can keep
But I
on
feel
going. Please interrupt me.
so. So I mean, let me say where I'm with you, where I'm not with you, where I'm following along, and then Christine can chime in. I mean, first of all, when you talk about the idea of evidence-based therapy, I think a lot of us who've worked in the field understand how problematic that phrase is. It's misleading because what the evidence actually points to is that the therapeutic rapport between the therapist and client is the number one factor in determining the outcomes of therapy, more than any given modality, let's say, right? But there are certain modalities that have been studied more than others. They've had more research money behind them. And so then they, there's the money for the studies. The studies come out saying, oh, DBT is effective. And then people take that to mean that it's more effective than other approaches when that's actually not what the evidence truly points to. But gosh, then you got into talking about what is the relevance of childhood and therapy for middle-aged people, which is certainly something we could explore. You talk about that being sort of an expectation that clients have coming into therapy, and maybe an issue of informed consent there in terms of how the therapist explains their approach, is a therapist who operates more in the present, in the here and now, with how symptoms are currently presenting in your life? Is this a therapist who's more, sort of behavior oriented? And then you just came out and said that you disagree with Bessel van der Kolk's work. So, wow, you put so much on the table with that.
Not where I thought I was going to go. But, this has recently been a hot topic in, personal conversations, but in professional ones. And then also as I continue to work with religious trauma and anything trauma itself, because now everything's potentially traumatic. There's financial trauma and verbal trauma and to the point where the term itself is pretty much meaningless. It's used purely as a form of, listen to me, I am therefore accurate in my assessment of a situation because I use the term trauma, because I felt it as a trauma. And we all are about lived experience these days, whatever that means. And therefore, we just carte blanche accept that one's assessment is somehow divorced from bias, heuristic, biology.
So let's slow it down because again, you're saying so many different things, right? I'm curious about your criticism of Bessel van der Kolk. I never know if I'm saying that name right, of his ideas. But I hear you kind of like leaping to an issue that I think is easier for more therapists to get behind, especially people like Christine, right? Which is that, we can talk about the nature of trauma and what can or should be called trauma, lowercase t, trauma, capital case T, trauma. But then there's the meaning attached to it and the way it's used for, let's say, secondary gain, the way it can be weaponized, and all of that. I feel like I want to separate that from your critique of, a book like The Body Keeps the Score, because I think our concerns about how these ideas can be used in an interpersonally manipulative way is definitely valid. But if you have a criticism of the idea itself that traumatic memories live in the body, I feel like I want to make sure I hear that idea in and of itself. But before we do, Christine, what are your thoughts?
Oh, no, I'm sitting here kind of thinking about what The Body Keeps the Score specifically, because I used to teach an intro to trauma class when I was teaching. And that's one of the books, that's one of the textbooks for the course. So I'm very familiar with it and with the ideas there. And I think that there's a real lack of, when talking about trauma and, people are sort of identifying everything as traumatic, that word gets tossed around. I totally agree with that 100%. But I think also in any good therapeutic experience, the client over time with good therapy intervention should be able to find points of resilience where they're able to grow through and grow out of that without it being over dominating or domineering their life, so that there isn't this sense of being a victim. It's a sense of, this is part of the history or story of my life. How do I take this and create a strength or strengths through which I could continue to move forward and be able to live a meaningful life? And I think the part about all of this, that including wokeness that's infused, if we go back to that kind of concept, is that the healing part, the growth, the resilience is completely cut off and divorced from, I would even use that phrase too, the actual events that people maybe are hiding behind or in some way attributing to everything that's going wrong in their lives, so that they don't have any responsibility whatsoever in creating the life that they want or the life they believe they deserve to have. So I think that's where kind of the split happens, is that piece, that resilience part, the growth, gets totally lost and it becomes something that's no longer part of the conversation. So those are just the thoughts that I was having as you were talking, David. and specifically about that book and about trauma in general.
I loved it because it goes, really big on looking at what are the underlying assumptions and how we kind of narratize, to make up a word on the spot, our experiences, and the fact that experience does not come with an automatic, indelible story. It doesn't come with its own defining, what we do in life is completely unconscious. It's not like any of us are sitting around going, I think I'm going to take this piece and that piece and put it together. I mean, they're thoughts ourselves. None of us are choosing them, and at least not initially. We're not sitting there going, I have this 10 possibilities and I'm going to think this one next. Even that example itself doesn't make any sense because we're already thinking it. And so the thing around, and what you talked about when it comes to that healing process, moving on from that traumatic experience, is in some ways to recognize that the experience itself does not have to be considered intrinsic traumatic in a defining way. And we already know this because we already know literally, sizable percentages of people who will experience the same event and do not come out of it, with whether or not you go all the way to the clinical perspective of PTSD or whether or not it has a long-term effect in other ways. We know this already, that a lot of people don't. Well, to me, that raises a real big question of like, well, wait a minute. If so much of this is tied to perspective, culture, one's relationship to notions like resiliency, then ideas that trauma is some kind of force that is indelibly connected with a physical element should at least be questioned, if not jettisoned, and which then goes to the heart of Vanderkolk's idea.
I love sleep. Sound sleep is a crucial foundation of good mental and physical health, from mood and concentration to metabolism and cellular repair. And I sleep very well thanks to my 8 Sleep Pod Pro cover. My side of the bed is programmed to be warm when I get in and cool down to a neutral temperature in the middle of the night so I don't wake up overheated like I used to. How would you customize your bed temperature? Visit 8sleep.com and use promo code SOMETHERAPIST to take up to $200 off your purchase. Even if they're already running another sale, this code will get you an additional $50 off. 8Sleep currently ships not only within the USA, but also to Canada, the UK, select countries in the European Union, and Australia. Thanks for considering purchases that support the show. I think it's a question of where these ideas belong, what context in which, what are the contexts in which these ideas are helpful, and where are they harmful? And I think one could easily sway too far in either direction, because there are, I would argue, plenty of people going around with unprocessed trauma that's living in their body, that's living in patterns of stress that they are carrying physically, that's manifesting as disease and disability in various forms, and where some healing work would really benefit their health, their happiness, their loved ones, their job performance. And self-compassion is such an important part of that, being able to say, wow, some really terrible things did happen and that hurt and I feel that and here's how I'm carrying that, right? And then that there are limits as well to the usefulness of, one could say, dwelling on the past, or I think what a lot of people are afraid of is sort of residing in a victim mindset. And I've observed so much, I want to say, hypervigilance around this victim mindset, because I think there are certain places in society where it's festering and proliferating to a really unhealthy degree. And then there are people who have valid concerns about that. And some of those valid concerns are based in, they see their adult son or daughter failing to thrive, or they see their employees not showing up to work and being able to compartmentalize their emotions on the job. There are people with real concerns about the fragility of this generation. And they have this sort of, toughen up mindset. But what I experience is I actually see both sides of this, because on the one hand, I share the concerns that you guys have. On the other, I have my own quote unquote lived experience as someone with a chronic health condition. And I've noticed that whenever I speak or write in the great World Wide Web about my, from one standpoint, you could say disability. I'm not disabled from working, but my ability to do a lot of physical things is really seriously limited. There's inevitably a swath of internet strangers that are just ready to pounce on me and criticize the victim mentality that they think they're seeing in me. I get the like, buck up, drink a cup of coffee and get back out there, kiddo. What do you think you are, snowflake? I get that. And my reaction is like, you have no idea who I am. Like, you're obviously projecting. I think it seems maybe like older crowds, maybe boomers who have their frustrations with millennials. They have no idea who I am. They have no idea about my work ethic. They have no idea how much time and money and research I've spent trying to heal myself, how motivated I am to be well, how much it bothers me to be sick. They have no idea that I should actually have probably been resting more. Like, I'd probably be further along in my healing if I wasn't working so hard. They just see someone talking about, oh, I have this chronic health condition and it's been really hard for me, and they're ready to pounce. And so it's like this hypervigilance has developed that I think flows both ways. And it's like, we're all seeing in two dimensions when really it's operating in four. And I want to bring sort of like a yes and mentality to the whole thing. And I wouldn't want anyone to walk away from this podcast thinking that a group of mental health professionals doesn't respect how trauma can hurt people, or that we think the solution is really just as simple as like, well, have another cup of coffee and lift yourself up by your bootstraps and get back out there. We do have a few more tools in our toolkit than, stop it therapy, right?
Well, and I think that's part of what you said earlier to Stephanie, that the most healing aspect or component of therapy, what we know is the relationship between the therapist and the client. And through that, through that relationship, through that avenue, I think what's important to remember, or what's important for me to remember, is that there needs to be enough time to have really delved into what these traumatic experiences are, how they've affected the client, before we go into let's heal yourself now and get up by your bootstraps, which we wouldn't do anyway. But the idea of resilience and growth, that doesn't happen overnight in the way that I see this, my viewpoint. That's something that takes time. And I think a lot of the relationship building you do with a therapist can lead to developing and seeing the resilience and the strength and the growth in yourself, and being able to identify that in yourself. And you are the expert of your own life. I really do believe that. But I think it's important that we don't dismiss the experiences and what people are coming in for. And I relate to you on the illness part as well, Stephanie, because I've had a pretty chronic condition myself for several years now, and that's affected my ability to do a lot of things. So I don't share that with many people. I seem very high functioning. This is kind of the way I present myself, because I don't want it to define me. But there are some real world effects that has on my relationships, that it has on my work, that it has on, time, my time for myself, time that I, need to figure out how to balance and commit to what. All of those things. So I think that jumping the gun and just getting to the healing is also not very valuable. The exploration in that relationship, I think, is crucial to being able to get to that next component of healing and resilience. And this doesn't go in like 1, 2, 3, 4 step fashion. It's something that's always kind of present at any given time and interchangeable. And, many things are occurring at once in the space of that session. But I think it's the over time, component of it being crippling, or it being something that you learn to live with and go forward in spite of or despite, but always being aware that, if you have an ongoing, and I can speak for myself with the health, this is always going to be an issue for me. It's always going to be something that I have to pay attention to. Not that I lead with it. It's not in the forefront of my mind every minute of the day. And it isn't for me because it can't be for me. But it's something that when it's time to stop, I get notified. My body tells me it's time. I start to get signs that, okay, I may be neglecting a little bit. And now I've got to go back and take care of myself so that I can move forward again. not so that I can be victimized in any way, for it, or feel, I want people to feel sorry for me, things like that. But anyway, so this is all just to say that I think the exploration part before we even get to that component is super important.
And I have an idea about why it can be so hard for people to treat those of us with chronic illness with compassion, respect, and understanding. I think it's partly that there's this hypervigilance that's developed, especially on the part of the people who are carrying the bulk of the responsibility, the people who have maybe pulled themselves up by their bootstraps or disassociated from pain or stress in order to show up and do the job, who are feeling worried that the next generation is going to be incapable. There's that dynamic is part of things. But I think there's also, someone pointed out, I was dialoguing about this on social media, the just world fallacy. This idea that people like to believe that bad things don't happen to good people. They also like to believe that they're in control of their own fate. And so for someone who, let's say, has not had a chronic illness, who meets someone like you or I, where our story is I was actually, healthy, happy, active, really motivated to be productive. And then this unfortunate event happened. For me, it was getting COVID, and it created a health crisis, and I have not been able to get myself back together, even though I've tried all these things. That story is incredibly inconvenient and scary if you're somebody who likes to feel in charge of your own well-being and likes to think that as long as I eat this way, sleep this way, do this, that, and the other, nothing bad will happen to me. I would never end up, disabled. Just to hear that, like, oh yeah, there's actually someone who has a really similar lifestyle practice and orientation to you who ended up in a health crisis. It's like they don't want to face the vulnerability that makes them feel. So there's I think that's where kind of the victim blaming comes in, right? That like, oh no, you must be doing something wrong. Whether it's that you got vaccinated or that you didn't get vaccinated. That's one reason I don't disclose my vaccination status, because people make assumptions, and there are ideologically intense people on both sides. So whenever I talk about my chronic illness, there is a camp of people who assume that I must have had vaccines and that must be the reason for my chronic illness. There's another group of people that assume I must have not had vaccines, and if only I had been vaccinated, I wouldn't be sick. Now, the truth is, there are people with my condition who have been vaccinated and people who haven't. So whether or not my condition is attributable to a vaccine or to having not been vaccinated is actually irrelevant. It's all like a projective test, and I'm not going to get involved with it, because the ideologues on both sides want to think, oh, it's because I've been vaccinated. That'll never happen to me. I'm smart enough. I got vaccinated. And then people on the other side saying, oh, well, I was smart enough not to get vaccinated, so I'm not going to get the vaccine injury, And either way, it's an attempt to emotionally distance themselves from the very real fear and terror of their own mortality and the fact that this could happen to them too. And I think that's where a lot of it's coming from.
The assumptive worldview and the shattering of the assumptive worldview. It's a phrase we used a lot in grad school anyhow, but that's kind of assuming that your world is completely under your control.
Or even assuming that a person is actually even thinking that. I mean, there's a lot of assuming going on here as to what is going on supposedly beneath, the person's mind, and we have zero access to it outside of, their verbiage. And, is it a way of describing, a person's antipathy to, certain medical science or certain practices or whatever that they want to, avoid, death anxiety? Maybe. It also could just as well be a allegiance to, one's tribe and a declaration of I belong to this through variations in status games. And if you were to point it out, many people would probably go, what do you mean? I'm not even thinking about my mortality. And this is where the, in some ways kind of bring it into the therapy relationship. This is where often I see the many issues do come up, is that we think of ourselves professionally as somehow having access to some secret knowledge, and that we need to inform the patient or client, whatever word you're using, to help them understand what's really going on unconsciously. And what ends up happening is what we're doing then is just simply providing our own perspective and adding in a whole bunch of notions that of course we think are right, because otherwise why would we share them? We're not actively sharing things we think are wrong. That would Nobody does that. So I mean, it's just like, so you know the which then goes into the heart of the relationship issue. The I was hit with that right from my first master's in mental health counseling. I was going, well, it doesn't matter what your therapy perspective is, it's all about the relationship. And of course, my immediate question then and ongoing has been, yeah, but what about the relationship is going on? Like, we're just throwing this word out, like, well, it's a relationship. Yeah, but what does that actually
Like,
mean?
what are the
Like,
elements
what's
of
the
a therapeutic
processes?
relationship that make it
Yeah,
especially beneficial? Yeah.
or even, I mean, is it even a special? Like, what are actually the mechanisms going on that result in, or seemingly result in, certain outcomes? But again, now we pose the question of, I mean, when you consider the fact that within six months, depression, there's like a 50% remission in depression without any interventions. And you're going, well, wait a minute. Is it the therapy that did it? Well, I guess it is if they engaged in it. Well, that's an assumption. I mean, what if they didn't do anything? I mean, the fact that placebo effects, are prevalent and by some estimations growing. The fact that people can actively engage in all sorts of, I mean, what, you know, we probably might consider any number of, ridiculous practices, but it's like, did you think it worked?
Well, I hear
What
you
level of
asking
conversation are we having?
I hear you asking so many good questions, David, and I think from one level the questions themselves could sound kind of cynical about the utility of therapy, but I don't think that's where you're going. I think you're raising questions that maybe we could explore. Like, what are the elements of the therapeutic relationship that make it beneficial to patients? Maybe we could explore some of that. I mean, I think it's, for one, I would say the right balance of safety and challenge is an important, ingredient, and that this is where the woke people that we criticize lean all the way into safety and not into challenge if you belong to a certain population. And if you belong to a different population, they think you deserve all the challenge and none of the safety, right? So I think that's one way that our profession has become polarized, where it's my view that every human needs the optimal balance of safety and challenge. And that for someone with a lot of trauma, someone who's really fragile, someone, in a certain condition, they might need to really start off building the safety before they're ready for much challenge. Some people are maybe ready to dive into challenge. And I would say among the people who are ready to dive into challenge, some of them might need to pay more attention to their needs for safety. Do you guys ever have that experience? Let's just start with that, actually. You ever have that experience where someone comes to therapy and they're like, just trauma dumping, just like telling you all the details without any regard for whether they feel safe with you yet? And you're like, wait a minute, hold on. I know I'm the professional and all that, and maybe the license behind my name makes you feel good enough to get started, but like, I'm a stranger to you and you're just telling me all this stuff. Like, can you just check in? Like, how's that feeling? Because I notice people who have a lot of trauma, especially like sexual trauma, complex developmental trauma, like they never learned to develop a sense of their own boundaries. Or does this feel okay with me? Do I trust this person? And so sometimes that's part of the therapeutic relationship. I know I just said a lot there, but what are your thoughts on that?
I agree. I was actually thinking of the opposite case. Client I had recently that, every session, I want to keep this as protective as possible. Every session was about, we're going to say, flying airplanes and her experience doing that. And it took a good year, even with my very gentle, just a little gentle challenging that maybe there's something else to talk about that is coming up within the context of those stories, that there'd be a line or two in there that I'd catch and think, this seems a little significant. We spent about a year with just talking about the airplane, flying these airplanes. Okay. And at some point after that, and it was just completely out of the blue, we start our session one day, and all of the sudden, the trauma and the history of abuse and very, very severe abuse just comes pouring right out of her mouth. And I'm taken aback. It's not that I didn't know there was probably more going on, but the fact that the fact that she could be just totally shut off and then turned on like a faucet that just overflows and floods the whole entire area was very fascinating to me. So that became a dynamic and a portion of the therapy, I think, in our relationship, is talking about what that was about. She was actually able to eventually say, I felt like I really needed to test you, which in and of itself has its own connotations, right? So I agree with you, because I do think that balance is super important, but I don't think we can rush that process. If it's too fast, it's a problem. If it's not fast enough, it's a problem. We could say there is no rushing of that. So I guess the timing and where we as therapists feel we need to be with the client at a certain point. When do they need to end therapy? When do they need to open up more? When do they need to be challenged more? We don't really know. I mean, we play around a little bit with trial and error and just see how that works, because we can't really make if we want to go back to assumptions, we can't make any kind of assumption about how long that's going to last, a particular period of time, how long they're going to take to open up, what they're going to do when they pour. I mean, I've had clients that have dumped their trauma in the second session and I never saw them again. So there was no ability for us to kind of look at, wait a minute, this is a little bit concerning. Is this how you maybe deal with your relationships in general? Is this why there's so much volatility in your relationships? Whatever the case may be. But we don't have enough information really ever to know when. And some people thought that the one client I was with, we were going too slowly. Well, we were going at the pace at which she felt comfortable and the pace at which I felt that, she was ready for. But again, I don't, it's all trial and error. I did try some things and some things fell flat and some things didn't. And that's kind of what it was about. But once we got to that point where the floodgate opened, there was an ability to take that and to put some containment around it, to put some boundary around it, and to explore it from a place that wasn't so emotionally flooded, we'll say, or so emotionally, charged that she couldn't even almost speak.
I love the example, actually, because so part of this goes into, because I have conversations about boundaries all the time, often. And in many ways, this conversation, I'm loving it because it's highlighting just how much I don't fit at all in the broader therapy community at this point. So this specifically, like boundaries themselves, often we'll hear like, I'm terrible at boundaries. No, nobody's terrible at boundaries. They're terrible at the consequences of maintaining them. It's everybody knows, we begin with a particular, coming back to the relationship question, like what is the nature of what are the contours or boundaries of the relationship that you have with a client per se, and what is being assumed, brought in, what is being brought in by you. I mean, by, the psychodynamic perspective would come into transference, countertransference is one way of looking at it. Here and there, it's different wording. But you're like, okay, what is each person bringing in, and the assumptions around what is and isn't good to perpetuate this relationship. There's at least a question that comes up of going, well, we've been talking for X amount of time and things are going well. And then the question at least should be coming up, I would think, of going, if they were to suddenly start trauma dumping, then one, yeah, like you said, rightly, like, where was this? And then two, why now? It's that question of like, we all get faced when somebody like, all right, we get to that 45-minute mark. And then it's like, and now I really want to talk about this. And it's like, wait, you've got to let, it's no different, I think, in process, because what does the person want to do? They want to perpetuate the structure that says this makes sense of my world right now, this thing that you and I have, which is what then is happening in all relationships. Like, we don't function in the world if, individualistically. We're bone deep involved in relationships, and by in an infinite number of ways, not to buildings, to the fact that we will think different things if we walk into a hospital as opposed to whether or not we walk into a school. It's just that the places themselves will incur different associational strategies that our brain tries to go, all right, I'm going to try to make sense of what do I need to do given the likelihood of certain situations that are going to arise. And same thing in the therapy, relationship. It's part of the reason why I will do that line that I did in the intro of going, I don't want to be your guru, because I'm setting up the stage already of going, there is an end point to this, because because the professional in relationship should serve a purpose. And that purpose is, and it could be wrong, but I don't think, the purpose is lifetime management. I mean, it might help me pay my bills, but it's like, but
So this brings up sort of a debate in our professional community that I certainly know people on both sides of, and it's sort of the depth approach versus the short-term brief therapy that fits better within the medical model, which is like, you have a problem, you come to therapy, we help you resolve your problem and move on with your life, which I really see advantages to both sides. Because Christine, you bring up this example of someone who had all this stuff that was really buried and something that was getting in the way of bringing any of it to you any sooner than that patient did. And so, that makes a strong case for why some people need to be in therapy, even when we're not sure why they're there, right? And I can think of other examples of that. And I feel, since you mentioned, David, transference and countertransference issues, we're talking about transference here partly. And I think it's important to remember, and the three of us certainly keep this in mind, and a lot of listeners of the show know this, people's prior experiences in therapy are definitely going to have an impact on their transference towards us and the pace at which they unfold. And, some of the times that I had similar experiences to you, Christine, of someone, staying on the surface for a really long time, and then finally, maybe a year into it, like opening up about some massive trauma that had occurred in the past. Sometimes that was very much tied in with previous experiences in therapy. And I think it's just important to remind, anyone who's interested in the subject that there are therapists who have incurred major gross boundary violations on their clients, whether that's, having a personal or a sexual relationship with them. There are therapists who have committed suicide and whose patients knew about it, or, might have been actually in the middle of care when it occurred or found out about it. There are therapists who have committed crimes and ended up in the news, and patients, former patients, have found out about that. And these are just a few of the most egregious examples. There are probably subtler ones as well, but we just never know. If we're seeing someone and it's not their first time in therapy, we never know if their last therapist tried to have sex with them, or if they saw their last, therapist on the 6 o'clock news. I mean, these are relatively unusual, not so common scenarios. But of course, doing the type of work I do, where I'm talking to detransitioners, like I just had an interview come out with Leighton, the 2-part, where, her therapist just committed the most egregious boundary violations, got her like working for her, and like projected her own dissociative identity disorder on. I mean, so I think just bearing in mind that we never know if someone has had those experiences, or maybe someone in their life has had those experiences, or similar stories have formed their impressions of therapy. First of all, it's like kind of a miracle that they're there, that they're even giving it a shot working with us. And then we just don't know what kind of hoops we're going to have to jump through for them in order to get to a point where they can finally say, yeah, in the back of my mind, I'm 5% worried that you're going to die on me, or whatever that underlying fear is,
I did have a client whose previous therapist died, and that was something she actually said to me is, I'm afraid because my last therapist died. It was very, very powerful. But anyhow, again, it's just, I just remembered it from you talking about it. So yeah, that was very hard for her.
And she should be. I mean, and that's just it. I mean, based on the previous experience, why did this person decide to bring this up? Are they, in fact, she used that recent example, afraid of that loss? Well, they should be, largely because that previous experience did happen. It makes it now possible in the sense that, yeah, how are we dealing with that? Well, now you start going into, what I think you were referring to back before, Christine and Sefein. It's just like, well, what do you process? How do you go about doing that? What is the outcome that we're looking for? To never fear again about it? Well, that seems a little fantasy. To have a better functional relationship with one's assessment, to recognize perhaps that our brains come up with stuff all the time, and really perhaps we shouldn't take our thoughts as seriously, automatically at least, without reflection, that it's just guesswork on the part of our heads based on its own, background of, well, this kind of happened. This is kind of similar to what's going on in the present. And now I have an idea of how I'm going to function going forward into the imagined or projected future. And where are the interventions with all of that?
I recently told you about a group called Do No Harm, who's working to do just that. Eliminate the harm that so-called gender-affirming care for minors and political ideologies in medicine are causing. Do No Harm is made up of thousands of members across the country, from doctors to nurses to policymakers to concerned parents who see what's happening at practitioners around the country and are waving a red flag. Membership is free, and you get unlimited access to information from experts, on-the-ground updates from people working in medicine or state houses to take a stand, and collaboration with other thinkers. Learn more and sign up at donoharmmedicine.org/sometherapist to learn more. That's donoharmmedicine.org/sometherapist. So I want to make sure to talk about what I promised we would talk about. I think we have been sort of skirting around it, but is therapy dead? Is therapeutic neutrality a thing of the past? What even is therapeutic neutrality? And how do we contrast that with informed consent, with, the ethical obligation to disclose to our prospective clients that we do have opinions and biases and, a cultural background that of course are going to inform the way we work with a given topic. And that while there are certain commonalities we would hope that all members of the public could expect from any given therapist in terms of, following the basic ethical principles, there's still a lot of variation. And, I think I mentioned up front, and I want to make sure to fulfill on this promise that we would give this example that came up before we started recording, that David, you and I differ on the concept of porn addiction. So maybe we can just dive into that.
One, I'm ridiculously Googleable. My opinions on most things pretty easily searchable. I'd imagine, and I'm sure, Stephanie, you've experienced this, and Christine as well, where you have people who may have encountered you in the past and then assume that you're going to respond in a specific way to something that they bring up. And to my mind, in the way that I look at the nature of how relationships work in all varieties, is, to me, that's like, to quote Yalom, grist for the mill. It's like, why do you think that? Like, what is being served by, which is a common question I will bring up with clients. Like, what, even to your own thoughts, what are your thoughts serving? What are they seeking to make happen, to, parse out the broad reality, because we can never grasp all of it. So we're always trying to do this piecemeal. And so what's the functional question that any and all behavior, what is it serving? What is its purpose? How is this trying to develop these things?
If I can pause you there, I'm glad that you brought up the things you did before we dive into the specific example of something as contentious as porn addiction, right? Because you talk about being Googleable and how that influences clients' perceptions of you. And this is something that you and I have in common, David, and you as well, Christine, because of your work with CTA, the fact that you've been on podcasts. People can find out what you think that you've shared on platforms where you're not acting as a therapist in that platform. You're speaking as a person who has the life experience of being a therapist and for whom that has informed your thoughts on various matters, including the practice of our profession, but including other things as well. And there's a huge, I think, ethical debate just around like, what are the ethics of a therapist having a public presence at all? And I think that that might have been relevant 20 years ago before the internet became what it is today. But nowadays, it's just not a matter of if you're going to have some things about you that are Googleable, but the nature of those things and just how prevalent they are and how you carry yourself with that in mind. And so for me, I feel like the last few years, it's been a rocky process of going from just being a therapist to being a therapist who was extremely Googleable, like you said, and it's shifted who comes to me. And now, like most people who come to me knowing about my work because of my work. And so that could be said to be part of the informed consent process. That being said, they still might have some surprises about what it's like to actually work with me. Just because I hold a certain opinion that I state publicly on a certain matter doesn't mean that with regard to the specifics of their life circumstance that I'm going to apply that same thinking. And then and then there are still some people who come to me who have no idea that I have a podcast. Now, I try, I think, for the process of informed consent, I try to make it very easy to know that I have a podcast because I'm not trying to hide that from anyone. I don't want anyone to feel like, they're my client for 6 months and then they discover I have a podcast and they feel like they've been deceived. I don't want anyone to have that experience. So it's all out there, and I try to make the messaging like, if you want to work with me, you're welcome to check out my podcast, my public social media, my blog. You're welcome to check these things out. You're under no obligation to do so. But, I also recently updated my website so that it says, if you go to myname.com, that's where you can find out both about my therapy and my consulting services listed separately. And, it says for helping adults, couples, and people impacted by the gender craze. You can look up my values. I try to have it all very out there in the open. Now, is that 100% guaranteed to prevent any circumstance where someone's going to be working with me and then be like, oh my God, I can't believe she didn't tell me that she has this podcast or that she has these views or, and of course, like if people are coming to me as therapy patients and they're disclosing certain values or worldview that I'm going to be operating within their framework. So yeah, it might feel kind of jarring for them to discover whatever they learn about me. I mean, and this goes down to the smallest thing. Like I remember a patient who assumed that I had cats. She just thought she knew I had cats. She had no reason to believe this other than the fact that she liked cats. And so and she liked me, right? So her transference was that I must be a cat person because I'm likable to her. And, it was like,
That's
and
awesome.
I'm not going to be like, no, you're wrong. I don't have cats. Like, it's, unless she asks, right? It could be that. It could be where I stand on religion. It could be all kinds of things. Like if it's not relevant to your therapy, I'm not going to bring it up. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't be surprised if you found out what I thought. But then there's also like, the process for the patient of navigating, like, can I see someone whose views might differ from me in terms of what they express personally, but in the context of therapy, they're able to respect my worldview and operate within that. Like, it's all part of the informed consent process.
Yeah. I mean, I had a client not too long ago who had seen all of, these podcast appearances and whatnot, and kind of had me on a pedestal to the point where I felt anxiety of performance anxiety that I had to rise up. I mean, we can spend all day talking about what that triggered in me, but I had to rise up kind of to this point of being this perfect and, oh my gosh, everything that I would say would be the right thing to say. I mean, and that caused me a lot of anxiety, I'll be honest. It really did, because I felt like it was very performative on my end, that I had to be in that kind of place because it was, but I learned a lot from that experience, what I would do differently next time if that same type of situation comes along where this kind of idea of perfection it's really a fantasy about who I am and about how it's going to go in therapy.
It sounds like there was like a projective identification process that happened where she put you on this pedestal and then you like unconsciously kind of rose to the occasion of like, oh, I guess I guess I have the answers now. I got, and like, and whereas that when we're picking up on the transference like that, that can be so rich to explore.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, what is it that makes you feel like you need someone outside of you to have some kind of authoritative guidebook to life that you don't have, you know?
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely correct. It was the first time I'd experienced something like that, but it certainly did bring up a lot of things that, again, I would just probably explore a little bit further in a different way next time. Speak, kind of agreeing with what you're saying, Stephanie, on some of the things that could have been explored in the moment. But I don't know. There's never a way to predict. I mean, that's the thing. I guess I just go back to it's so hard to predict who's coming through the door or who's coming through the computer. We're all doing telehealth now, but it's hard to predict what that's going to be.
Looking for authority, looking for answers. That's part of why I offer consulting practice instead of therapy for ROGD parents. And one way that this is a gross oversimplification, I don't mean it 100%, but just to bring it into stark contrast, it's sort of like this. If you want to know what I think, hire me for consultation. If you want to know what you think, hire me for therapy, right? The job of a therapist is to help their client clarify their own thought process. But there are people who are coming to me not because they need therapy, but because they're worried about someone they love and they need to understand the gender craze and they needed to understand it yesterday because their kid just came out as trans and they're trying to figure out what to do. And, and that's when I'm like, don't read those books, read these books. Oh, you said that to your kid, wrong move. They're actually going to take it this way. Like if you want to know what I think about how to talk to your kid, it's consulting. It's not therapy because you're asking for me to be the authority figure. And I'm actually willing to do that because I've spent the last few years focusing really intensively on this issue. And I do have information and I don't want to have to explore your transference toward me as perceiving me as authority figure for therapeutic relevance. I actually want to help you solve the problem in your life, which is how do I talk to my kid?
Why are people coming to us as therapists? Like legit, like they didn't go to a mechanic. They didn't go to the bartender. Maybe they should have, depending on who they're talking to. But it's like, they came to a designated professional.
Yeah.
There is a entire social apparatus that is geared around we are the final arbiters of truth of what happens inside your mind. It's just it's complete fantasy. It's in fact I love the example Christine you gave around the perfection.
Mm-hmm.
Until you started asking questions about this person, like, what are you wanting me to do?
Right.
You don't actually know what their countertransference is occurring. In fact, I'm now using that term again. Is transference and countertransference the notion of a kind of projected unconscious energy being placed on this other person? Or is it because one, we never have access to that. And unless you think that consciousness is capable of being disembodied and put out there as some kind of magic, then what we're really doing is having a conversation around my assumptions about what I think you're thinking, and the other person having assumptions about what they think they're thinking, and so on and so forth. And until you actually have the conversation around, well, what are you actually wanting?
Yeah.
If you're looking for a simple way to take better care of yourself, check out Organifi. I start every day with a glass of their original green juice powder mixed with water. It contains moringa, ashwagandha, chlorella, spirulina, matcha, wheatgrass, beets, turmeric, mint, lemon, and coconut water. 100% organic with no added sugar. It's the best tasting superfood supplement I've ever tried. It's super easy to make, and it makes me feel good. Organifi also makes several other delicious and nutritious superfood blends, such as red juice, immune support, protein powders, a golden milk mix, and even superfood hot cocoa. Check out the collection at Organifi.com/sometherapist. That's ORGANIFI.com/sometherapist. And use code SOMETHERAPIST to take 20% off your order. So guys, I'm gonna radically change gears here because we have 10 minutes left, and I promised our audience multiple times that we would talk about this one really hot button issue. So let's pretend that Christine is therapist shopping. And Christine, can we also just pretend that you're a male as well? Because let's be honest, porn addiction is a much more common issue in men than women. Like it is an issue for some women, but like really it's a
Sure.
male issue. So let's pretend Christine is a
Yes.
man who's shopping around for a therapist.
Yes.
And I'm curious, like, so your presenting issue is porn addiction. David, what's your philosophy? What's your sort of informed consent that you start with up front? And then I'll give mine because it's going to sound so different.
So usually I'll ask like, okay, so how are you defining your addiction? Because I don't want to, one, I don't want to assume because everybody's coming in. It's kind of like going, well, I feel depressed. I don't know what that means. Like it's going to show up differently. I'm anxious. Yeah, I don't know what that means. Like, how is this actually, impacting your life? So I would start with, okay, well, what is, how is this showing up? What are the behaviors that you are identifying as, indicating addiction?
Oh, I was going to say, I can even just speak from a client I had. It's my girlfriend who thinks that I have the addiction.
Mm-hmm. Which is so very common.
She sent me here. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Very common.
Which is, again, common. So then the behaviors that, occurred, whatever they may be. So I'm assuming probably, since anything's online these days, I mean, who really gets a Playboy magazine anymore? I mean, I'm already like generationalizing myself referring to even Playboy. Do they even have a publication anymore? Anyway, but it's like, so then we would explore like, okay, well then what happened with this?
Mm-hmm.
When did she find out that you were doing something that you were,
Yes.
I'm going to assume, hiding from her?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. She found out that I was hiding this from her and that I was more interested in watching porn than I was in having sex with her.
Okay, so there's definitely a couple of things there. One, you were hiding.
Mm-hmm.
So there was I'm assuming that you don't have as part of your relational agreements to keep secrets. I'm just assuming. But, so you were violating then a agreement, tacit or otherwise. And then two, you were then using that, porn, and I'm going to assume masturbation. It wasn't just the watching of it.
Yes.
So then you were using this sexual release activity as opposed to the, sexual activity with your girlfriend.
Yes.
Okay.
That is correct.
Is that the kind of relationship that you want?
Mm-hmm. I love her and I want to be with her. I don't want her to think that I find them more attractive than her because I don't. I'm literally like role playing an actual.
Oh yeah, no.
So
yeah, this is the languaging is so common. It's remarkable. Like I'm thinking about half a dozen other clients right now saying the same thing.
Right.
So then you don't want to, because you care about her, you want to be with her in, I would assume then, a sexual way.
Yes.
When, we only have a few more minutes. I mean, it's like, so we go into like, when did this start happening? What was going on contextually? What do you get out of, what's the function out of finding essentially orgasm through masturbation? And then going, okay, well then why, it's often then an issue of ease. It's an issue of non-judgment. Often there are issues of even attraction. It's easy to say, well, of course I don't think of these, pixelate, CGI enhanced, often women online as somehow, we say this thing about we don't find this person as or more attractive, but that's where we start getting into it. Let's just be honest. Like at a certain visceral level, that's the purpose. I mean, it's like sugar in food. Why is sugar added to deli meat? Because we want people to keep eating it, even though there's probably better alternatives. And so then we go into like, okay, well, what's the outcome that we're looking for here? If for that matter, is porn use a issue of, addressing a sexual need that one is perceived as not being able to, do so for various reasons relationally, or at least in that particular, or is it, and, is it one that could be, substituted by having a broader conversation about what this does? Is it an issue of enhancement? Like, a sex toy or anything like that. What are the nature of the agreements that the person had with their, significant other or relationship? Because those, of course, I mean, sky's the limit.
I'm going to have to jump in here because we need to wrap up in a couple minutes.
Sorry. I'm like,
so we didn't have the opportunity to do a sort of an in-depth compare and contrast. What I'm learning is that your approach isn't as diametrically opposed to mine as I initially thought when you made a really bold statement before we started recording, which is that porn addiction doesn't exist. I was like, that could be a full debate in and of itself. Philosophically, we could bring in brain science, we could bring in all kinds of stuff. But what I'm hearing is that you got really specific about the function in this person's life and the motivation. So there's a little bit of sort of motivational interviewing there, looking at the attachment needs in the relationship, which I think is important. And, I think where I suppose we might disagree if we were to explore this further is, some of your framing around like this idea of attraction, this idea of sexual needs and so on, because it's my belief from what I've learned about porn addiction that watching porn creates lower levels of satisfaction with real partners, especially for men, both in terms of the way real women look, the way real women perform in bed and all of that. And that, that continuing to watch porn for a heterosexual man in a relationship with a woman is destructive to that relationship for a number of reasons, in my view. That it makes his partner feel insecure, which can drive up attachment issues and conflict all around, makes her feel less appreciated, which is probably going to lower her motivation to show up as her best self in the relationship. And then there's that, again, the unrealistic expectations. And so this sort of thought process, I think I would have used different words than you, David, around the thought process, because I don't think of it as either a man has certain proclivities or he doesn't, and that his porn use doesn't affect that either way. I think that choosing to continue watching porn is going to increase his dissatisfaction with his partner in terms of her looks and what she's willing to do in bed and stuff like that. And that quitting porn, focusing on the relationship and nurturing his partner's secure attachment is going to result in more satisfaction for both people in the long run. That's all my philosophical framework. It doesn't really necessarily get to how I would approach a client with this issue, because of course with a client I'm also building rapport, I'm also gathering their perception of the problem and all of that. So I think our approaches might be kind of similar up front. But I just want an opportunity to sort of compare and contrast, just to give an example of how, even like-minded therapists who are showing up to be on the same podcast together are going to have different philosophies about something that, I think we picked a good one because it's sort of a hot, spicy topic and also a really, really common one that affects so many people's relationships. So I'm glad that we got to explore that. And so since we need to wrap up, let's just sort of recap where people can find you guys and any closing points you wanted to make in 1 minute. David, we'll start with you.
So, yeah, man, that is a whole longer conversation because
really
I definitely don't agree with most of the points. So maybe another time. So, but yes, people can find me, at lifeweavings.com. That's my main website. But all my writing is now kind of shifting over to, Substack platform. So you can, Google my name for that matter, or it's lifeweavings.substack.com. Always love, we're often anymore these days, I'm writing about criticizing some of, the kind of sacred cows of therapy and poking at some of the things that kind of touched on here. And so by all means, if you have questions, I can always use the prompts for writing further. So yeah, reach out.
It's easiest to find me through criticaltherapyantidote.org. If you go to the About Us page or meet the team page, I'm there. And there's also a link to the chapter that I wrote for the book we put out last year. So that gives a little bit more information about me as well, and how to contact me is on there too. So best way to go. Otherwise, I do have an ad on Psychology Today. If you do a Google search or a search on their website, you can find me that way as well.
Well, thank you both so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist podcast. To check out my book recommendations, articles, wellness products, guest episodes on other podcasts, consulting services, and lots more, visit sometherapist. Special thanks to my producers, Eric and Amber Beals at Different Mix, and to Joey Pecoraro for our theme song, Half Awake. If you appreciate this podcast and want more people to find it, kindly take a moment to rate, review, like, comment, and share on your platforms of choice. Of course, just because I am some therapist doesn't mean I'm your therapist. This podcast is not a substitute for medical advice. If you need help, ask your doctor or browse your local therapists online. And whatever you do next, please take care of yourself. Eat well, sleep well, move your body, get outside, and tell someone you love them. You're worth it.